Of May 7th, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Jayme Closs walked around her kitchen inside of her apartment in the little southeastern European city of Kosovo. Kosovo is a quiet place at the base of this huge mountain in northern Macedonia, and while it's totally beautiful, it's utterly remote, and basically nothing really of note happens here. Jayme cleaned houses for a living, but on this particular day, she was on a day off, and so she was just kind of hanging out at her apartment, waiting for her adult son, named Zoran, to come home. It was a beautiful, warm evening that night, and so Jayme had the windows in the kitchen open as she walked around making herself something to eat, and at some point, as she was doing this, she heard her phone ring. And so she grabbed it and answered, and she heard the sound of her friend on the other line. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained and very uncomfortable, and she was asking Jayme if she was paying attention to the news right now. Did she have the radio on or the TV? And Jayme was like, no, why? And the friend would tell her that all over the news right now, there was this huge, terrible traffic accident that had happened in their town. And unfortunately, Jayme's son, Zoran, who she was waiting for to come home, was apparently involved in this accident. Jayme let out a strangled cry when she heard this, and then just dropped what she was using to make food and turned and ran out the door. And when she did, her neighbor who was outside saw her emerge and yelled out to her, hey, is everything okay? And Jayme, as she literally just continued running towards the road, she basically blurted out to the neighbor that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. And this neighbor watched as Jayme just ran down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared. Jayme did not have a car of her own, and so literally she was going to run to the hospital to make sure her son was okay. A little while later, that same neighbor who had just watched Jayme disappear around the corner heard a knock on their door. And so the neighbor went to the door, they opened it up, and they were totally shocked at who they saw standing outside. It was Jayme's son, Zoran, who did not appear to be hurt in any way. But before the neighbor could ask any questions about this, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, said to the neighbor, hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet and have dinner together, and it's just totally unlike her to disappear without telling me where she was going. The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, having no idea what was going on here. And then the neighbor was like, well, wait a minute. Zoran, were you in a car accident? And Zoran's like, no, what are you talking about? And then the neighbor kind of filled Zoran in about how they had seen his mother run outside, and she had mentioned how her son had been in this car accident, and she literally ran to the hospital. Zoran was just as mystified by this as the neighbor was, and so Zoran just grabbed his phone and called the hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital picked up, they would tell Zoran that his mother was not there, she had not been there all day, and two, even though they had heard reports about this car accident in town, there had not been any car accident victims brought to the hospital at all that day. And so by the end of that night, when Zoran really had no idea what had happened to his mom, where she was, or, what was going on with this car accident thing, he just did the only thing he could think to do, which was go to the police and report his mother missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, when still Jayme was missing and the police had no idea what happened to her, there were no new leads, nothing. On this day, a 56-year-old reporter named Vlado Teneski, who actually happened to live not that far away from where Jayme lived, he got a call from one of his police sources. And the source would tell him that Jayme had actually just been found, even though this was not public information, and unfortunately, Jayme was dead. Her body, which had been beaten and strangled and stabbed, had been found wrapped up in plastic and dumped in this illegal dumping area not far from the town's football stadium. The source told Vlado that when her body was searched, they discovered she still had valuables on her person, and so that kind of ruled out the possibility that this was a robbery gone wrong, which was the initial theory about what they were seeing. However, when police had done an initial probe into Jayme's life to figure out who this victim was, they discovered that she was just this poor old cleaning lady who had no enemies to speak of, and so it really just made no sense that she was the victim of such an obviously brutal and intimate murder that was not financially motivated, at least not on the surface. Vlado thanked his source for all the information and then hung up. Vlado's source had sounded really shocked by this murder as he was telling Vlado, but now, as Vlado was sitting here thinking about what he had just been told, he wasn't really shocked as much as he was suspicious. He felt like something just was off about this murder. Maybe Zavana appeared to be this poor old cleaning lady with no enemies, but in reality, maybe that wasn't who she was. Maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled upon something she was not supposed to see, and that got her killed. Vlado had no idea, but he just felt like, there's something off about this, and it needs to be investigated. Now, Vlado had a reputation in town for being this very aggressive and kind of fearless journalist who had no problem diving headfirst into some of these really murky stories that could involve corruption or misuse of power, and he would get to the bottom of it, and he would publish these articles where he spoke really critically about the government, about police, about anybody really who was in a position of power. But as a result of conducting himself this way, over his 30-year career, Vlado had been threatened with violence many, many times for things he had written or things he was about to write. But even though Vlado knew this Zavana murder case had the potential to once again put him in hot water with the powers that be, he still felt like it was his responsibility to dive into this thing and get to the truth. So, feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, and he walked out the front door of his house, and he made the several-minute-long walk over to Zavana's house. And when he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door, and a few minutes later, Vlado and Zoran were sitting in the kitchen talking about what had happened. Zoran told Vlado all about how he came home and discovered his mom wasn't there, and then he went to the neighbor's house, and they explained how, they had seen Zavana running off to the hospital to go look for Zoran, but Zoran's like, I'm not hurt, I didn't get into a car accident, what's going on here? And as Zoran spoke, Vlado took lots of notes and asked lots of follow-up questions, and by the end of this interview, when Vlado felt like he knew everything there was to know about Zavana, he felt like he actually had a pretty good working theory as to what actually happened to Zavana. And the reason he felt like his theory could be accurate had to do with what Zoran told Vlado his mother did for a living, that she was a cleaning lady. Now, it took Vlado a couple of days to put together his story. He had to go out and interview dozens more people in the neighborhood. But finally, on May 19th, so just 3 days after Zavana was found murdered, Vlado published his story in the newspaper. And the story's explosive headline read, "A Serial Killer Stalks Kisevo." Did you know that this YouTube channel is not the only place where we post strange, dark, and mysterious content? No. We also have the MrBallen podcast, which has over 180 episodes, all strange, dark, and mysterious, that are available to listen to right now on Amazon Music. And at least half of them are completely exclusive to the podcast, which means you cannot get those stories unless you listen on the podcast. But that's not all. In addition to the MrBallen podcast, we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries podcast, which, you guessed it, covers medical mysteries. They're all strange, dark, and mysterious, but medical is the focus. And that podcast is available on all podcast platforms, but if you listen on Amazon Music, you can get batches of 8 episodes that get released in seasons. On all other podcast platforms, it's 1 episode a week, but Amazon Music, it's like a binge. So again, in addition to this YouTube channel, there are 2 other places, MrBallen Podcast and MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where you can find more new, original, strange, dark, and mysterious content. Go check them out. In the story, Vlado says that Zavana's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, her murder was likely linked to 2 other murders of 2 other women. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Zavana. Literally. They were poor, older women who were also cleaning ladies. And so that was why when Vlado was talking to Zoran, and Zoran described how his mother was, what she did for work, what she looked like, that Vlado started to remember these other victims, and he put it all together. The other 2 victims were 64-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and the other victim was 56-year-old Lubitsa Lukoska, who was murdered in 2007. Now, Vlado's story was totally explosive, because what he's saying is that there is a serial killer that is on the loose in this town. But this story was also highly explosive because Vlado spoke very critically about the police who were involved in this investigation. Specifically, he pointed out that the '05 and '07 murders of those two other women, those had been totally mishandled because arrests had been made in at least one of those cases, and clearly whoever they arrested was innocent here. And so the police just totally dropped the ball, at least in Vlado's opinion. And when the police read Vlado's story, they were very upset at him because he was so critical of them. However, the police also did see that Vlado had managed to uncover a lot of new details from all of his interviews with witnesses and people in the neighborhood that did seem to paint a picture of this potentially really being a serial killer, not individual isolated killings. And so the police, based on Vlado's story, would actually begin investigating a serial killer in their midst. They linked all three murders and they began basically a new investigation. However, at the same time they began this new investigation, Vlado began to notice that he was being tailed all the time by police. He would be out in town doing his job, reporting and interviewing people, and there'd just be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance watching him. But Vlado had anticipated that no matter what, he was likely going to face some sort of blowback from the police, and so he just kind of accepted that they were going to watch him and maybe try to intimidate him, but it wasn't going to bother him because he had done his job, he had reported the story the best that he could, and if they wanted to watch him from a distance, they could do that. By early June, so about 2 weeks after Zavana had been found murdered, the police, in this new serial killer investigation they were doing, had narrowed down their suspect pool, which was in the hundreds, down to just 3 people. And they felt like they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, so by this point Vlado is still being trailed by police all the time, but the police have not come out publicly and said anything about the serial killer case. They're just continuing their investigation. But on this day, June 20th, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer telling the editor they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. And as soon as their conversation ended, the editor called Vlado to tell him the news. But when he called Vlado, Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his calls. And the editor was also thinking to himself how strange it was that this officer had contacted him and not Vlado. Like, why aren't you going to the guy writing the stories and telling him about this new development? Why are you coming to me? The editor would continue to try calling Vlado several more times, but Vlado never answered. And so ultimately, the editor just kind of assumed that Vlado must be busy, interviewing someone, or maybe more likely, he had already learned about this imminent arrest, and he was on scene, ready to capture in real time this arrest that was about to take place. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kosovo, the police had surrounded this very modest 2-story home that was very overgrown up front. It was surrounded by tall fir trees, and all the windows had heavy drapes covering them up. And then once the police felt like they had totally surrounded this building, a team of officers walked up onto the porch and knocked on the door and yelled out that they were police and whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. And for a moment, it was just totally silent and tense. And then the police on the porch heard footsteps inside the house. They had their guns ready to go. And then the door slowly opened up. And this man, who seemed very unthreatening and kind of confused, stepped out onto the porch. And the police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper headquarters, Vlado's editor got another phone call. And when he answered, it was the same police officer who had called before to warn him about this upcoming arrest. Except this time, the officer was calling to say the arrest had been made, they had caught their serial killer, and then he told the editor the name of the person they arrested. And when the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado. It would turn out that Vlado appeared very professional and calm on the outside, but inside he was full of rage, specifically at his mother, who he viewed as this terrible, cruel person. And after she died in 2002, Vlado became obsessed with this idea of getting revenge on his deceased mother. And the way he decided he would do that would be by killing random women who just kind of looked and seemed an awful lot like his mother. I.e., they were poor, older, and cleaning ladies. His 3 victims, Mitra in 2005, Lubitsa in 2007, and Zivana in 2008, had all personally known Vlado's mother. And so Vlado had actually used that connection to gain each of his victims' trust, and then once he had their trust, he would lure them away to strangle, stab, and beat them to death. In Vlado's explosive newspaper story, he lied about a whole bunch of things just to throw the police off. Like, for example, he made up that he spoke to a witness who claimed to have seen Zivana get into a car with 2 men right before she vanished. Vlado did not see that. That was just a total lie designed to confuse the police. Vlado had also been the one to plant that story on the radio about Zivana's son, Zoran, being in this terrible accident. That had caused Zivana to run out of her house and be vulnerable to be scooped up and killed, which is exactly what Vlado wanted. He had called the radio station and told them about this accident, and because he had previously worked for that radio station, they believed him without doing any fact-checking and broadcast the story. And so really that whole radio broadcast was just a very intentional trap by Vlado to kill Zivana. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was in the article he wrote, he left in some really specific details that the police had not revealed to the public. And so basically by including these in the story, it meant Vlado had an inside scoop into what was really going on. Like, for example, Vlado said that all 3 of these women who had been killed by the serial killer had been strangled to death by telephone cords that were left at the scene. But again, the police had not revealed that to the public, and so when they read the story, they actually became very suspicious of Vlado and thought he could be involved in these murders. And so when Vlado felt like the police were trailing him just to intimidate him, in reality, the police were trailing Vlado because they thought he could be the murderer. And eventually, when they got a DNA sample from Vlado, it was confirmed that their suspicions were right. He was the killer. After Vlado's arrest, he was immediately charged with 2 of the 3 murders, and the police were getting ready to charge him with the 3rd, and they were even looking at a 4th victim, potentially, that maybe Vlado had killed as well, but they weren't entirely sure yet. But on June 23rd, so just 3 days after Vlado's arrest, he died in jail in a way that really didn't make any sense. Vlado had drowned in a small bucket of water inside of his jail cell, while there were 3 other people inside of that jail cell with him who all said they didn't notice it happening. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide, and after his death, all of the murder investigations were closed. In 1985, 17-year-old Michelle Avila, who just went by the nickname Missy, was a high school junior living in the working-class town of Arleta, California, which is located just north of Los Angeles, California. Despite Missy being very physically small, she was under 5 feet tall and barely weighed 95 pounds, she had a big presence about her, and it made her very popular at her school. Not only was she incredibly beautiful, with boys and girls falling over themselves to try to win her affection, but also Missy was just very kind and gentle and didn't seem to take herself very seriously. But life for Missy was not all perfect. A year earlier, during her sophomore year, a nasty rumor had been spread around Missy's high school that Missy had apparently been sleeping with all of these boys who were in established relationships with girls in the school, and even though this rumor was a total lie, by the time the rumor reached the girlfriends of these boys that Missy had apparently slept with, these girls believed it. And so to get their revenge on Missy, one day after school, when she had walked outside, this group of girls ganged up on her and beat her really, really badly. In fact, the beating was so severe that when Missy came home, her family immediately pressed charges on the girl that seemed to kind of lead the attack. Her name was Sonia Bon. But despite Missy and her family immediately filing these charges, the case dragged for months and months and months. But finally, by October 1st, 1985, so at the beginning of Missy's junior year, Missy was within a week of actually going to court and taking the stand and testifying against Sonia. And while Missy was certainly nervous about going to court and testifying, she knew deep down she was making the right decision. On October 1st, so a week before Missy is set to testify, Missy came home from school and she told her mom that she had plans that afternoon to go hang out with her friends. This was fairly routine for Missy, who had a big circle of friends, and so her mother, Irene, told her that was totally fine, but you gotta be home by 6 p.m. Missy agreed, and then just a couple of minutes later, a 17-year-old girl named Laura Doyle, who was very close with Missy, she pulled up outside of Missy's house and she honked the horn. And so Missy heard her, she said goodbye to her mom and to her brother, and then she left the house, ran to Laura's car, hopped inside, and the two girls drove off. A few hours later, at 6 p.m., Missy had still not come home yet. However, her mother, Irene, was not that surprised. Missy was not really a troublemaker, but she really liked staying out with her friends, and so it wasn't that uncommon for her to stay out past curfew and then come home and ask for forgiveness, or she would stay out past curfew and then she would call her mother and ask for more time. And shortly after 6 p.m., the phone rang inside of Missy's house. And so Irene, she hears the phone ringing and she's expecting it to be her daughter. And so she walks over, she picks the phone up and says, "Hello?" But it's not her daughter. It's another young girl's voice. It's Laura's voice, the girl who had picked Missy up after school to go hang out with friends. And before Irene could ask Laura why she was calling, Laura kind of awkwardly asked Irene, "Hey, is Missy home?" And Irene would say, "Laura, she left with you. Isn't she with you?" "No, she's not here. She's running late. Why? What's going on?" After Irene said this, Laura began to panic, and then she proceeded to tell Irene what happened that afternoon while she was out with her daughter. She said after she picked Missy up, the two of them just kind of drove around town, which they did all the time, and then at some point they made their way over to Stonehurst Park, where Missy and Laura and a bunch of their friends would often go and hang out. And so they drove over to Stonehurst, they made their way into the parking lot, and as soon as they were in there, Laura began looking around for other cars that she recognized to see if maybe their friends were there. But after looking around, she didn't recognize any of the cars, and so Laura just reflexively began turning the car around to leave the park. But as she was doing that, Missy stopped her and said, "Wait a minute, I know the guys over there. I want to go say hi." And so Laura stopped the car and she looked in the direction that Missy was pointing, and on the far side of the parking lot were these two guys who appeared to be maybe in their late teens, early 20s. Laura did not recognize either of them, and they were standing outside of this blue car, a blue Camaro. Now, Laura was accustomed to Missy just kind of knowing everybody in town because everybody loved Missy and Missy loved everyone. And so this type of situation was not totally uncommon. However, Laura was just not very excited at the prospect of going and hanging out with these two total strangers to her. But she could tell Missy really wanted to, and so she turns to Missy and says, "Okay, go out there, go say hi to them, and I'm going to park and I'll meet you in a second." And so Missy, she hops out of the car and she begins walking over to these two guys and she's waving to them and they're waving back and smiling at her. And Laura, meanwhile, pulls the car into a parking spot. She throws it in park and she's about to get out when she notices her gas gauge is below empty. And so she calls out to Missy, who's now halfway to these two guys, and she says, "Hey, I'm going to go fill my car up with gas and then I'll come back and I'll meet you." And so Missy turns around and she's like, "Okay, bye." And so Laura puts her car back in drive and she pulls out of the lot and she heads into town to get some gas. A few minutes later, when Laura pulled back into the Stonehurst parking lot, she looked in the direction of where the blue Camaro and the two guys were and where Missy was headed, and they're all gone. Missy is nowhere to be seen. Now, this was 1985, so Laura could not just call or text Missy to see where she had gone. And so instead, Laura just sat in the parking lot looking at the vacant spot where the blue car had been, kind of going over in her mind what she should do. And eventually, she told herself that, you know what, Missy was a big girl, she can handle herself, she knew those guys, I'm sure everything is just fine, and those guys will drop her off at her house when she needs to go home. And so even though Laura is telling herself this, she would leave the Stonehurst parking lot and spend a while just kind of driving around town looking for Missy and looking for this blue Camaro and these two guys. And after finding none of them, she would head home. And then right after 6 p.m., Laura picked up the phone and she called Missy's house because she knew Missy's curfew was 6 p.m. and so she should be home by now. But of course, when Missy's mother, Irene, picked up the phone, Laura would learn Missy had not come home. And so Irene and Laura are immediately really worried about Missy, but not to the point where either of them think they should involve the police. Instead, Laura and Irene would spend the next couple of hours after that 6 p.m. phone call calling everybody they could think of that might know where Missy was. And when that yielded no results, Laura and Irene actually met up that night and began going door to door to all of Missy's friends and acquaintances' houses, asking the occupants if they knew where Missy was. But by late that night, no one had given them any information about Missy's whereabouts, and so still feeling very concerned about Missy, Laura and Irene decided the best thing to do was just to go back home and go to bed and hope in the morning Missy turned up or someone contacted them with information about where Missy was. But the following morning, Missy had still not turned up and no one had heard from her, and so that morning Irene went to the police and told them what was going on. Immediately, the police honed in on Laura and began going over every single detail of what that blue Camaro was doing, what those two guys looked like, what did Missy say about these two guys? Did she get any information about where they might go or who these guys were? And Laura, she was totally guilt-ridden and emotional about being the last person to see Missy before she has apparently vanished. And she sat there trying to give every bit of information she possibly could about what had happened that day, but unfortunately, she was just too far away from these two guys and their vehicle. She could only give them a sort of basic physical description, which Laura even admitted was not very accurate because it was really far away, and frankly, she wasn't looking that hard. And so after getting all the information they possibly could from both Laura and Irene, the police launched a very extensive search all over Arleta, California, and the surrounding areas. And while they were doing that, Irene and other members of Missy's family, along with Laura and other close friends of Missy's, began their own search. But after a couple of days, neither the professional search nor the amateur search had turned up any new information about Missy's whereabouts or the whereabouts of those two guys and their blue Camaro. But then on October 4th, just 3 days after Missy went missing, Missy would be found. However, it would take investigators another 3 years to finally make sense of what actually happened to her. Based on eyewitness testimony, here is a recreation of what happened to Missy on the day she vanished. On that day, which was Tuesday, October 1st, 1985, Missy came back from school. She told her mother she wanted to go out and hang out with her friends. Her mother told her, okay, be home by 6. And then a couple of minutes later, Laura pulled up outside and honked the horn, and Missy ran outside, hopped in the car, and they drove off. The pair would drive around town for a few minutes before making their way to Stonehurst Park. Now, to understand what happens next, you need some context. Missy had two best friends. One of them was 17-year-old Laura Doyle, who she was with, and the other was another 17-year-old girl named Karen Severson. These three girls had met when they were in grade school, they lived basically on the same street, and they spent virtually every second of every day together. However, a month earlier in September, the trio had had a falling out because a month earlier, another rumor about Missy sleeping with boys who had girlfriends began circulating around the school, except this time the girlfriends in the rumor were Laura and Karen. Now, of course, Laura and Karen were well aware of the fact that a year earlier, Missy had been accused of something similar and it had all been a big lie. And so going into this new rumor, Laura and Karen knew that the likelihood of it being real was very slim. But because this rumor directly involved them and their boyfriends, they felt a little concerned. And so Laura and Karen went to Missy and they said, hey, we don't think it's true, but is it true? Did you sleep with our boyfriends? And Missy immediately is like, are you kidding me? No, I didn't sleep with your boyfriends. Did you see what happened last year? It's the same thing. It's a lie. It's just a rumor. I can't believe you would think I would do that to you. And so pretty quickly, this discussion escalated to a full-blown fight between the girls. Or more specifically, it turned into a full-blown fight between Karen and Missy. Because Laura, she was worked up about it, but pretty quickly she was able to calm down. But Karen, she didn't calm down. Because apparently Karen had seen Missy at some point flirting with her boyfriend. And so when this rumor began to circulate, Karen felt like, you know what? It could be true. She might have had sex with my boyfriend. And so eventually the three girls just stopped fighting. Not because they had reached some sort of compromise, but rather because Missy just tried to turn around and walk away. And when she did, Karen wound up and slapped her across the face. And as soon as that happened, all three girls knew a line had been crossed, and now their decade-long friendship was potentially ruined. Over the next couple of weeks, Missy and Laura were able to come together and patch things up, but Missy and Karen continued to avoid each other. However, the distance between them really wore on both of them, and so finally, on the morning of October 1st, Karen would reach out to Missy and she would apologize. And Missy was really touched by this, and before long, Missy and Karen and Laura had made plans for that afternoon to meet up at Stonehurst Park to have a good day together, just like old times. So that afternoon, Laura picks up Missy from her house, and the two of them drive around for a bit before heading over to Stonehurst Park, where they're planning to meet Karen. But when Laura pulls the car into the parking lot, they look around and Karen is not there. And the blue Camaro and those two guys standing around it on the far side of the parking lot, they weren't there either. Because Laura had made up the blue Camaro and those two guys. They never existed. That was all just a big cover-up for what happens next. A few years ago, I was told that my anger issues were actually tied to something much bigger. I was depressed. But despite agreeing with this conclusion, it was still really difficult for me to go out and get help. I just felt really uncomfortable at the notion of walking into some doctor's office and telling some stranger about my feelings that I didn't even understand. But with the encouragement of my family and friends, I did seek out a therapist, and honestly, it saved my life. So if you have a lot on your mind right now, but you've put it off because it's too uncomfortable to go out and get help, then today's video sponsor, BetterHelp, is for you. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you don't ever have to walk into the doctor's office and have some super intense in-person conversation about your feelings. Instead, you can get the help you need from the comfort of your own home. On BetterHelp, all 20,000 plus therapists, without exception, are licensed, trained, experienced, and accredited psychologists, marriage and family therapists, clinical social workers, or licensed professional counselors. They also all have a master's degree or doctorate degree in their field, and they possess at least 3 years and 1,000 hours of hands-on experience. Therapy really does work, and BetterHelp is the most accessible, affordable, and convenient therapy option out there. Visit betterhelp.com/MrBallen. That's better, H-E-L-P, and join the over 2 million people who are taking charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. Special offer for you, get 10% off your first month when you go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen. So Laura and Missy, they pull into the parking lot at Stonehurst, and they park in a spot and proceed to wait for Karen. And Karen would show up just a couple of minutes later. But when she showed up, all hell broke loose. Karen came flying into the parking lot and came to a screeching stop right up alongside Laura's car. Karen had parked her car so close to Laura's car that Laura literally couldn't open her door without striking Karen's car. And in Karen's car, in the passenger seat, which was closest to Laura's car, was a terrified-looking 17-year-old named Eva Cherambolo, who was friends with all three of the girls. And that day, Karen had apparently asked Eva to come over for dinner, but after picking Eva up, without giving her any explanation, she had flown over to Stonehurst and then came to this screeching stop right next to Laura's car. And so Eva is sitting in the passenger seat looking at Karen and looking over at Laura, and Missy having no idea what's going on, and Karen begins yelling at Eva to roll her window down. And so Eva rolls her window down, and Laura and Missy are looking over in absolute astonishment, and then once the window is down on Eva's side, Karen begins screaming across Eva out the window at the car that Laura and Missy are in. And so Laura and Missy exchange totally confused looks, and then Laura rolls her window down, and suddenly Laura and Missy can hear what Karen is yelling. And Karen is hurling the most vile and horrible insults at Laura. not at Missy. It takes Laura a second to realize what Karen is yelling about, but once she realizes that Karen is just ruthlessly insulting her, Laura just turns and begins hurling insults back at Karen. And so the whole time, Laura and Karen are just screaming at each other. Missy and Eva are just sitting in their respective passenger seats, having no clue what's going on. And just as quickly as Karen had arrived and begun screaming at Laura, Karen put her car back in drive and sped right out of the parking lot. And Laura at this point is totally incensed and enraged at Karen for some of the things she had said. And so Laura fired up her car, threw it in drive, and before Missy could tell her otherwise, Laura had sped out of the parking lot after Karen. And for the next 45 minutes, Karen and Laura drove like absolute maniacs north of the city up into the mountains, where the whole time they're driving, Karen is swerving side to side, and she's speeding along these desolate roads, and Laura would speed up and get right on her bumper, like she was experiencing this extreme case of road rage. Now, for the first few minutes of this, both Missy and Eva were desperately trying to get their drivers to calm down and just pull over. Whatever you're fighting about, it's not worth crashing and dying over. But little did Missy or Eva know, there was something much, much bigger going on between Laura and Karen. And so their requests to stop the cars fell on deaf ears. Finally, after this 45-minute white-knuckle insane drive along these mountain roads came to an end when the road they were on kind of funneled them into this dirt parking lot in the middle of this huge forest. And as soon as they reached this parking lot, Karen came to a stop, and Laura narrowly avoided smashing into her and came to a stop right next to her. And as soon as the two cars were stopped, both drivers hopped out and were immediately in each other's faces, shoving each other, screaming at each other, just continuing this awful fight. Eva just stayed in the passenger seat and did nothing. She was just hoping that whatever was going on would eventually end and they could leave. But Missy, she's looking out there at her two best friends who seem like they're about to kill each other. And so Missy decides she's going to get out and try to separate them. And so she begins to open her car door. And the second she does, both Karen and Laura, who were maybe 5 or 6 feet away from her car door, they both immediately stopped fighting. It was like a switch had been thrown, and whatever was going on had come to a complete and total stop. And at the same time they have suddenly stopped fighting, both girls simultaneously turn and look at Missy. And before Missy could say or do anything, Karen and Laura ran over and positioned themselves right outside of Missy's door. So Missy could no longer shut the door, and Missy could not get out of the car. She was totally trapped. And as soon as Karen was in position right outside of the car, Karen kind of got down and got right in Missy's face, and with a very menacing and hissing voice, she looks at Missy and says, "You know, this whole thing was a joke. Me and Laura, we weren't actually fighting. We're not mad at each other, but we are mad at someone. We're mad at you." And then Karen and Laura would reach down and pull Missy out of the car, and they would slam her back up against the side of Laura's car. And then Laura and Karen pressed up against her and began screaming at Missy that she had slept with their boyfriends, and they knew it. And this whole time, Missy is trying to tell them, "No, I didn't. I did not sleep with your boyfriends. I don't know what's going on." But at some point, Karen and Laura were screaming so loudly, and they were right on top of her, that Missy just kind of began to shut down, and she went quiet and kind of tucked herself into a ball. And as soon as this happened, Karen and Laura, they grabbed Missy and they began pushing her away from the car towards a trail that led into the forest. And Missy, she's 4'10", 95 pounds. She's tiny. And Karen was 5'2", over 200 pounds. And Laura was 5'6" inches tall and weighed 135 pounds. And so Missy knew she could not put up a fight. She had no chance against these two. And so Missy just kind of began shuffling her feet, walking towards this trail. And periodically, Karen and Laura would walk up and push her to walk towards this trail. And as this is happening, Eva, who had been sitting in the car the whole time, she finally got out and kind of walked up behind the group, but didn't participate. She just walked along behind them. And so after a couple of minutes, Karen and Laura had managed to push Missy all the way to the actual start of the trail, this narrow trail that left the parking lot. And at that point, Laura walked around Missy, so she was in front of her, and Karen stayed behind Missy. And the two girls ordered Missy to keep following them into the woods. and Missy did not put up a fight. She just put her head down and continued walking along the trail behind Laura, with Karen behind her, periodically pushing her, and then several steps behind Karen was Eva, who just continued to do nothing. After the girls had walked for a little while on this trail and were out of sight of the parking lot, Laura came to an abrupt stop and she turned around to face Missy. And by this point, Missy was genuinely terrified. She was crying, she had her head down, and she was just hoping that her captors were going to let her go. But once they stopped and Missy looked up at Laura, Laura wound up and decked Missy right in the face. And as soon as she hit Missy, Karen immediately jumped in. And before long, Missy was on the ground getting punched and kicked and stomped on by Laura and Karen. And again, Eva just stood there watching, doing nothing. Eventually, Laura and Karen would stop beating Missy. And at that point, Laura would pull out a knife and she would reach down and she would grab Missy's hair and she began hacking it off. Missy was not a vain person, but she loved her hair. It had to be perfect anywhere she went. It was her prized possession, and Laura and Karen knew it. And so Laura, she begins hacking off the hair with her knife, and Karen, who wanted to get involved but didn't have a knife, just began grabbing Missy's hair and ripping it out with her fists. Finally, after much of Missy's hair had been hacked off of her head, Laura and Karen stopped and just stood up and looked down at Missy, who was now in the fetal position, just crying to herself. But Laura and Karen were not done. At this point, they got out restraints and they tied Missy's hands behind her back and they gagged her mouth. And again, Eva did nothing. Once Missy was completely restrained, Laura got up and began walking towards a nearby stream that was about 10 feet away from them down a hill. And so Laura gets down to the stream. She wades in about halfway where the water comes up about 8 inches on her leg. And then she turns around and she looks up the hill at Missy and Karen and Eva, who's off to the side. And Laura, while staring directly at Missy, she reaches down and begins running her fingers through the water and says to Missy, "Why don't you come down and get in the water with me?" When Missy didn't move, Karen, who was standing next to her, hauled her up and then pushed her down the hill. And Missy doesn't have the ability to brace her fall because her hands are bound. And so she slams down on her face and she rolls down to the edge of the water, and there she stops. And before Missy can get up, Karen and Laura had descended on her. They'd grabbed her by the shoulders and they began dragging her out into the water. And so Eva, who's watching this happen, again does nothing and just turns around and begins running down the trail back towards the cars. When she gets to the cars, she discovers they are both locked, so she can't go anywhere, and she was too far away from anywhere to walk. And so her only choice was just to go back down the trail to where her friends were. And so Eva goes back to this trail and she begins walking in the direction of the stream. And as she's walking, before she can see any of the girls, she hears a terrifying, blood-curdling scream coming from somewhere deep in the forest. And Eva was so terrified that she stopped where she was, she turned around, and she ran back to the cars. Eva would sit down on the ground between the two cars, and she would begin to rock back and forth. After nearly an hour of doing that, Karen and Laura suddenly emerged from the trailhead, soaking wet and laughing. Missy was not with them. After Eva had turned around and run away from the stream to go back to the cars the first time, Laura and Karen had grabbed Missy, dragged her into the water, and laid her on her stomach in the 8 inches of water. And so Missy is trying desperately to keep her head out of the water, but Laura comes around and grabs her legs and presses them into the water, and then Karen comes around and grabs the back of Missy's head and forces her head down into the water. Missy would start fighting for her life, trying to wriggle her way out of the water, and at some point she would manage to get out from under their grasp, and as soon as her head cleared the water, she took in a big breath and then let out that piercing, horrifying scream that Eva heard as she was walking back down the trail, which scared her and caused her to run away again. And after Missy let out that primal scream, Karen readjusted her grip and pressed her head back into the water. Missy would continue to squirm and fight against Karen and Laura, and periodically she'd get her head up out of the water just enough to get a little gulp of air, and then she'd choke down a bunch of water and have her head pushed down into the water again, until finally Missy's strength just started to ebb. And when Karen and Laura sensed that Missy was on the verge of death and she was very weak, they seized the opportunity and they leapt off of her just long enough to run over to the side of the stream where there was this big, heavy log, which investigators would later determine weighed over 100 pounds. So it weighed more than Missy, And Karen and Laura, they'd pick this log up, they'd walk back into the stream, and they'd drop the log directly on the back of Missy's head, forcing it down into the water permanently. A few minutes after drowning Missy in the stream, Karen and Laura walked out of the trail. They got into their cars. Eva climbed into Laura's car, and the girls just left the parking lot and drove back home, leaving Missy in the woods. 3 days later, a group of hikers were in that forest near where Missy had been killed, and they spotted her body in the stream. When police arrived, they found cigarette butts, a beer bottle, and men's overalls lying out near where Missy was found. These items were there entirely coincidentally. They had nothing to do with what happened to Missy, but they somehow made the lie about Missy being with those two guys in their Camaro before she vanished seem more believable. Mostly because when Laura described these two guys to police, she kind of made it seem like they were bad boys or troublemakers, like the type of guys who would go off into the woods and smoke and drink for fun. And so the police just continued to chase down this two guys and a blue Camaro lead until the murder case went cold. But 3 years after Missy was murdered, Eva, who had been threatened by Karen and Laura never to say a word about what she knew, finally came forward to police and told them that Karen and Laura had killed Missy. When Karen, Laura, and Missy became teenagers, Missy really blossomed into this beautiful young woman who everybody seemed to adore. Meanwhile, Laura and Karen had the opposite experience. They felt awkward in their bodies and felt like no one really liked them. And so in time, they became very jealous of Missy, and that jealousy turned into resentment, and that resentment turned into hatred. And so in 1984, it was Karen and Laura who started that rumor about Missy sleeping with all these boys who had girlfriends. And that lie would get Missy attacked and beat up really badly. But that wasn't enough for Karen and Laura. They felt like Missy deserved worse. And so the following year, in September of 1985, Laura and Karen decided to kill Missy. Their plan began with spreading another rumor about Missy, about how she was sleeping around with boys with girlfriends, except this time the girlfriends in this rumor would be Laura and Karen. They did this knowing this rumor would start a fight between the three of them, and they knew that Missy just would not be able to be mad at her friends. She would want to make up with them. And so Karen and Laura, they start this rumor. It does cause a big blowout fight between the three of them. But then after this fight, Laura very intentionally makes up with Missy and kind of says, hey, let's make things right again. And so she pretends to be friends with Missy. And then a couple of weeks later, on the morning of October 1st, Karen would contact Missy. She would tell her how sorry she was. And she asked her, hey, do you want to get together today, all three of us, just like old times? And Missy fell right into their trap because she was so excited at the prospect of getting to spend time with her two best friends who she really did love. And so she quickly agreed to meet up with them. And so Laura and Missy, they arrive in the parking lot of Stonehurst Park, and then Karen comes flying in, and there's this huge fight, and there's this 45-minute drive up into the mountains where they reach this parking lot, and Karen and Laura are fighting with each other, and Missy has no idea what's going on, and then all of a sudden, the fighting stops. Because the fighting wasn't real. It was all rehearsed. Laura and Karen had done that in order to throw Missy off guard and to get her up into this forest up in the mountains where they could kill her. It's unclear why Laura and Karen brought Eva along, but most likely she was brought along as a decoy as well. After Missy's body was found and the police were on this mad hunt to find these two guys and the blue Camaro, Karen actually moved in to Missy's family's home. She told them she just wanted to offer support during this really difficult time, but in reality, she just wanted to keep close tabs on the investigation, and any chance she got, she wanted to make sure she threw police and Missy's family off of her and Laura's trail. And so for months, Karen slept in Missy's bed. She ate at the same dinner table where Missy would eat with Missy's family, and Karen would spend hours out in the car with Missy's mother, Irene, and other members of Missy's family driving around looking for clues about where Missy could have gone or who really was responsible for Missy's death, When the truth finally came out 3 years later that Karen and Laura had been the ones who killed Missy, Missy's family could not believe that their daughter's killer was literally living with them the whole time. Ultimately, Laura and Karen would be found guilty of killing Missy, and they would each be sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Karen Severson was paroled in December of 2011, and Laura Doyle was paroled a year later in December of 2012. So with today's case, the Jayme Closs case, the reason I ended up choosing this one and making a TikTok version of it, and now a YouTube version of it, is actually pretty straightforward. It's because even though it's true, if you were to make a movie out of this case, the viewers wouldn't really believe it because the perpetrator in this case has no motive and has no history of committing any crimes. I think he had a parking ticket. And he targets a child. I mean, putting that all together, you don't see that. That is not a popular archetype for a movie. The idea that there are just these random, perpetrators out there just targeting random children and harming them and their families. There has to be a motive, especially when it comes to children being involved. There has to be a motive. And in this case, there really wasn't. And even the perpetrator, when he was in prison, he wrote a letter to Jayme and her surviving family members where he kind of tried to explain why he did it. But even he didn't have strong enough language to communicate what it was. He made it seem like it was pretty complicated, and even he didn't know. He just said, hey, look, I'm not a serial killer. I just had to do this, and I don't really know why. So it's just one of the more disturbing cases when you go into it knowing that this whole thing was perpetrated by someone who had no criminal history. He had no connection to the victims, except that he randomly had a chance encounter with one of them. And it just kind of happened. It's just one of those horrible things that even now, no one really understands, including the killer himself. So let's dive into it. In 2018, 21-year-old Jake Patterson is on his way to work at a cheese factory in Wisconsin. He'd only been working there for a couple of days. This is like his third day on the job. He's this kind of typical guy leading a typical life in Wisconsin. And he's driving his Ford Taurus. He comes to a stop behind a school bus where middle school kids are getting on the bus. And he's sitting there and he looks up and he sees for the first time in his life a blonde-haired, green-eyed girl who ended up being 13-year-old Jayme Closs. And as he's sitting there, because this all came out in a very lengthy confession, so we have lots of details about this case. As he's sitting there watching Jayme, who again, he doesn't know, get on the bus, he has this realization that she is going to be the girl that he takes. He actually says that sitting behind the wheel, he's like, I realized right then and there that she's the one I'm going to take. And so a guy with no criminal history, he's sitting there coming up with this plan of how he's going to abduct this girl. And it would come out later in his confession, which again was very lengthy, that he put a ton of effort into planning out this abduction. So let's talk about Jake's plan. He takes his father's Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun, which is a very commonly purchased weapon. He assumed that because it is, so widely purchased, it would be hard to track. Okay, so he takes his gun, takes a couple slugs, so he's got his weapon. Then he goes and purchases a balaclava, so a mask, a whole head mask from Walmart. He shaves his head, shaves his beard so that there wouldn't be any hairs, for forensic evidence at the crime scene. This is all so premeditated. He went out and purchased gloves and wiped his gloves all so they wouldn't have prints on them. He purchased steel-toed boots and dark jeans and a dark jacket. In the car he was going to use, because he plans on abducting Jayme, and he knew he was going to be keeping her in the trunk. He cut the cord inside of his vehicle. It was when you press this button inside the car, it would open the trunk. Basically, he didn't want any access to the trunk unless you had the key. So he cuts that cord. He disconnected the dome light inside of his Ford Taurus, to try to better conceal him when he's in the car. I mean, this guy, he's really thinking hard about how he's going to do this. He knew he was going to go in that house, he's going to take Jayme, and he had his big plan, right? 2 separate times, Jake tried, unsuccessfully, to abduct Jayme. He drove to their house the first time, and there were cars in the driveway, so he got spooked and he leaves. He comes back and he's about to drive up the driveway when lights come on, so he leaves again. But on October 15th, 2018, he was, unfortunately, he was successful. It was around midnight when Jake Patterson rolls into the Close family's driveway. The lights in his car are off, the headlights are off, and he rolls into the driveway. And inside of this very modest home, Jayme was sleeping with her dog, Molly. And Molly hears the car pull into the driveway and starts barking. Wakes up Jayme. Jayme looks out. She sees a car she doesn't recognize. It's the middle of the night. And she runs to her parents' room and she alerts her parents. Jayme's father, James, he goes to the front door with a flashlight. Meanwhile, Denise, that's Jayme's mother, and Jayme retreat into the bathroom where they shut the door. They sense that this was potentially going to be a home invasion, and certainly they were right. So they actually barricade the door with a dresser that was in there. And they get in the tub and they shut the curtains. And so James is at the front door and he watches Jake Patterson get out of his car, calmly walk up the steps to the front door. And at this time, James is thinking that perhaps this is the police. And so when Jake arrives at the door and starts banging on the door, James shines his light out through the window, kind of gets a peek at him, then moves over to the door itself where there's this little tiny window on the door. And he looks through, shining the light, and he says, "Show me your badge." And unfortunately, it was at the same time that Jake raises his shotgun and pulls the trigger, shoots right through the glass, hits James, and James dies immediately. Back in the bathroom, Jayme would later say that when she heard that shotgun blast, that she knew that her father was dead. And I think Denise, her mother, knew that as well, because immediately Denise picks up her phone and calls 911. As she's talking to the dispatcher who said that there were no police in the area, so further confirming that this was definitely not the police, because they didn't see that interaction at the door, they just heard it. Jake, at the front door, is trying to bust in the door. He can't do it, so he takes his shotgun, ejects a spent round, and then puts a slug through the doorknob, making it come wide open. He pushes it open, steps over the body of James, and begins to search the house. The house is empty. Every door is open except one, and it's the bathroom door where Denise and Jayme are hiding in the bathroom. Jake begins to try to push the door open. He can't do it. And finally, he just starts trying to smash the door in. And after 10, 15 blows, he actually managed to split the top half of the door open because the dresser was blocking the lower half. He goes into the bathroom and he rips down the shower curtain, and there is Denise bear hugging and protecting her daughter, Jayme, in the tub. Jake hands duct tape to the mother, Denise, and tells her to put duct tape over the mouth and the hands of her daughter. She refuses. She's protecting her daughter. Jake sets his shotgun down, pushes Denise aside, and does it himself. And then, after getting Jayme out of the tub, he picks his shotgun up again, aims it at the mother, turns his head, and he pulls the trigger and he kills the mother. Picks up Jayme. She's only about 5 foot, 100 pounds. And he drags her out to his car, opens up the trunk of his Taurus, puts her in, shuts it, and he's on his way. He was in the house for a total of 4 minutes. He would say in his confession, Jake, that as he's driving away, about 20 seconds after departing the house, he saw all the cop cars coming down the road. And actually, police officers would say they remembered a Taurus yielding to the police cruisers as they came in. He makes his way around them and off he goes. And Jayme would say she remembered hearing the sirens and then they fade as they disappear. Jake would drive 70 miles to his house, where he would keep Jayme prisoner. For the next 3 months, investigators, the local population, everybody is looking for Jayme. And at the same time, I mean, people didn't have high hopes for her safe return. I mean, in the vast majority of cases like these, where, a child's been abducted, unfortunately, they usually don't get home safe. And so the whole community is just devastated. This is gaining national attention. Everybody's looking for Jayme and they can't find her. The whole time, she was being held 70 miles away in Jake Patterson's cluttered, kind of crummy house that was out in the middle of the woods. When they got to his house, he burned her clothes and his gloves and the duct tape. He gave her his sister's pajamas. And then he had her go under the bed, this bed he had in the house, and he barricaded her underneath the bed. And so she had a pillow and a blanket, and she was just underneath this bed. That was it. She basically was ignored. I mean, her captor, Jake Patterson, he puts her under the bed and he warns her, if you leave or try to escape, bad things are going to happen to you. And because she did witness him kill her parents, she knows he's capable of that, and he knows that she knows that he's capable of that. So he had this stranglehold on her where he basically just said, you're staying under the bed, and don't you dare leave. And she listened, and frankly, you can't blame her, right? And so she would go stretches of 8, 10, 12 hours of laying under the bed with no food, no water, no bathroom breaks. But ultimately, she was just kind of ignored. There wasn't really a plan for, what was going to happen when she got to the house. He just kind of neglected her. After 2 weeks where he was really on guard and he told her that he was keeping a shotgun right outside her door in case anything went down with the police, when no one came looking for them or when no one arrived at his place, he felt very confidently that he had gotten away with his crimes, to the point where Jayme would say, he started having guests over. He had friends over and he just told her, stay in the room, don't come out. And so for 87 days, that's how it was. She just was neglected. This poor girl was underneath this bed, just wondering what the heck's going to happen, with obviously no time to grieve over the loss of her parents. Mr. Patterson, he really didn't leave the house. And when he did, I think he left one time to visit a grandparent, and he was very aggressive in warning her that he would hurt her if she tried to leave. But for the most part, he didn't leave the house. But you could tell in looking at this case that he became fairly confident that he was just going to get away with this. And so he actually applied for a job. And he left one morning to go to the interview. And it's kind of funny on his, in a dark way, he wrote on his, what did he write? On his application that he's an honest, hardworking guy. And under skills, he said he doesn't have much work experience, but he shows up to work and is a quick learner. And so here he goes. He goes out to just get a job and go back to normal. And when he left that morning, Jayme, who's under the bed, she's done. She's not going to be a captive anymore. And as soon as he leaves, she pushes aside the barricade of, there's some weights that were there and dressers. She pushes it all aside. She runs out. She puts on his shoes, which are too big for her. She puts them on the wrong feet. And she runs out the door. She doesn't know where she is. She doesn't know anything, but she's gone. A woman was walking her dog around 4 p.m. Her name was Jeannie Nutter. And she sees this girl, this teenager, who doesn't have a coat on. She doesn't have gloves on. It's bitterly cold. They're in the middle of Wisconsin in the wintertime. And she sees her coming towards her, and she can tell kind of instinctively that something's wrong. Okay, this is not just some nice kid coming down the road. There's an issue here. And as she got closer, and the girl said, "I'm lost. I need help. My name is Jayme," the woman, Jeannie, said that she immediately knew who it was. She lived in the area, and she had seen the posters up for Jayme. She knew exactly who she was. She gave her a big hug and held her and said, "I've got you. I'm going to take care of you." And so holding her closely, she brings her to a nearby neighbor's house. She said, this is Jayme Closs. We have to call the police. And they go in there, and the homeowners got their weapons out, and they guarded the door, and they huddled around Jayme while Jeannie called the police. And the police just didn't even know what to do. They were so shocked that they had found Jayme Closs that it actually took a minute for them to recognize what they were saying and how urgent it was that you come here right now, because at some point her captor, who can't be that far away, is going to recognize that she's not there anymore. And so they send the police, and luckily Jayme's brought in and is saved. Certainly not from the emotional toll, but she's physically safe. Jake comes home from his big job interview, and he sees that Jayme's gone, and he sees footsteps leaving his property in the snow, and he goes out looking for her. And, just because this is the way things go sometimes, he was immediately rounded up by the police. They found his car, they found him. And as soon as he was pulled over, he didn't resist. In fact,